Welcome to today's CompetencyWorks and Coffee interactive webinar. I'm Laurie Gagnon, the director of Aurora Institute's CompetencyWorks initiative. I hope that you've refreshed your coffee or your preferred equivalent and are ready to chat about what's in and what's out for the CBE field this year. We're delighted that you're here. So we welcome to introduce yourself in the chat with your role, your location, and a personal in and out from your list. We are testing out a new format today in response to various people in the field saying that they want to connect more with each other. So let's hope that deepening the CBE community stays in 2024 and beyond. Aurora's mission, vision, and values drive our work. We hope that we can have fun today with the what's in and what's out theme, while also sparking ideas and dialogue that ultimately help us transform our education system so that all people have a pathway to thriving, especially our young people. Before we dive in, let's pause for a moment of acknowledgement. And I'm going to read this acknowledgement. Aurora Institute and CompetencyWorks acknowledge that this virtual webinar takes place on lands that have been home to Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. We acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of our regions, Turtle Island, and beyond. By focusing on the whole child, real-world application, and learning in context, competency-based education uses similar principles to traditional Indigenous education. Whether intentional or not in the initial design, we acknowledge that CBE ideas reflect traditional Indigenous education approaches that long predate CBE. We want to take a moment to honor the ancestral grounds that we are collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that Indigenous peoples have shown worldwide. Specifically, we reflect on the profound impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples through education systems and brutalization faced as their traditional knowledge systems and ways of being were marginalized and suppressed. I am currently tuning in from my home in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is on the traditional unceded territory of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Namkeg. So let's get started. We welcome your active participation throughout, both in the chat, which I see has already started, thank you, and in the breakout discussion groups where we'll spend about half our time today after I kick us off with the CompetencyWorks in and outs. These meeting invites are here to guide us in community, have fun while reflecting, engage with agency and an open mind, and active listening. Accept and expect non-closure. We're just going to start the conversations or pick up some conversations and hopefully keep going. And we invite you to share your thoughts on social media too, if you have them, and tag the Aurora Institute. And this is being recorded. The opening and the final share out is being recorded, and we'll share that out along with the slides. All right, our first in is student agency. The science of learning tells us that cultivating agency rather than compliance is going to lead to lasting learning. The ability to direct our lives, our learning, and our work helps us to gain a sense of self-efficacy, and the same is true for adults and for young people. So let's continue to lean into student-centered learning practices and also think about how we can model what it can look like to partner with young people and push our own practice as we support them to build the skills they need for their future. This could be inviting students to co-present with us or participate in generating solutions to the challenges in our schools, in our communities. We can get involved in our own local schools, especially if we have children, and advocate for getting started with practices like student-led conferences and exhibitions, and beyond. And a culture of agency helps young people to thrive, but it also is serving the broader learning community, the people who are supporting and loving the young people themselves, because we're all more likely to be successful and feel more motivated when we're confident in our own abilities to accomplish meaningful goals. We'll be carrying student agency through this whole year, and stay tuned for an upcoming CompetencyWorks webinar showcasing some schools that are and how they're fostering student agency K-12. Our first out is seat time. We've long known that it's time to move beyond the traditional system based on the Carnegie unit that uses the credit hour as a way to measure learning based on how much time students have spent in a classroom. This is the fundamental premise of CBE. We're going to focus on learning, not time. And last year, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching announced that it's seeking to rethink the Carnegie unit that it itself created back in 1906. So as Carnegie and others, including ETS, think about how to design a different system and how to assess a broader range of both academic and non-academic skills that students need for success, the CBE field has an opportunity to share what we've learned in the past decade plus to support a true re-envisioning of the Carnegie unit and really work to not just swap out standardized time for standardized assessment of our graduate profiles. So let's codify our models and think about how we might start to support scale and really work to be sure that seat time is an out. Our next in is navigating generative AI. There's a lot of conversation about what to do in education with artificial intelligence, and some of it is fear that our traditional teaching styles are not going to adequately prepare students for an AI-driven future, that AI tools could generate more undetectable methods of academic cheating. And the CompetencyWorks team wants to push back against these fears. Less than a year after the release of ChatGPT, let's really embrace generative AI in our learning environments and use AI to support more personalized learning opportunities while building towards competency for every learner. When used effectively, AI can serve as a tool for educators and students alike, whether it's tailoring lessons to specific students' individual needs, to generating ideas for community-based, interest-based projects. Let's embrace AI and build the skills, both in ourselves and our learners, to be able to use AI ethically and strategically for good. And there's lots of buzz around generative AI, so lots of thought-provoking things and ever-changing. An out that we're hoping for in 2024 is using large-scale, high-stakes test assessment to track student progress. In one New York Post analysis of New York State Education Department data, about 1 in 5 students refused to sit for the state's standardized reading and math exams for grades 3 through 8 in the last spring of 2023. So people in New York and beyond are rethinking whether standardized tests should be our main metric for evaluating student achievement and also the quality of our schools. Ranking and sorting students in an after-the-fact autopsy isn't getting us to our desired outcome. And after 25 years of No Child Left Behind style accountability, we know that there are performance gaps on large-scale tests, but we also know that this is at least partly inherent in the design of the tests themselves. And we also know that an overfocus on test preparation is taking up too much instructional time. It's narrowing the focus of teaching, and it can harm learner identity and the trajectory of students when results are used to actually make decisions about who has access to different programs. And those students that are most likely to be harmed are also those most likely to be marginalized by the system in the first place. Literacy and numeracy are absolutely essential, and there are many ways to assess those skills, and we have the tools to do that in ways that are more relevant and meaningful and closer to the learner. Which brings us to our next in local assessment systems, always in 2024 and forever. Assessment systems are at the heart of a competency-based education system. They allow for students to develop and demonstrate and get feedback on the broader set of skills that in our graduate profiles that center essential skills and dispositions. These skills can feel harder to measure because we're less familiar with those methods, but we have performance assessment knowledge that can enable students to show what they know in relevant and rigorous ways and provide meaningful and relevant data to students, to teachers, to families, and for accountability purposes as well. When educators are supported to develop assessment literacy, they can create, assess, and calibrate evidence of learning. And as a result, we get strong local assessment systems. Large-scale standardized tests, if we continue to use them in a transition time, shift from being the definitive judgment of how we are doing, to a way of checking, validating, and improving our local systems that are hopefully already telling us how our students are doing in their learning in real time. Our last out is silos and competition in the field. Organizations in the CBE field, Aurora included, often collaborate and partner. It's central to our work. Yet, let's also acknowledge that and interrogate that there's sometimes an undercurrent of competition for funding, for work that remains when it comes to staying viable and relevant. So in 2024, let's look ahead to the next decade and shift to a new level of field coordination, coherence, and collaboration. We can make the case for this work. We know there's more than one pathway to transforming the learner experience. Let's communicate this and unleash the demand for learner-centered transformation within the education field, beyond our CBE corner, or hopefully growing CBE corner, and also cultivate demand and understanding from the broader public. And if we do these things, we'll have more than enough work to keep us all busy as we help communities shape their vision and goals for their students and make that a reality. We've learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. So together, let's build momentum for the transformation and build a movement of movements. Lastly, let's ground ourselves in relentlessly pursuing equity for every student to access an education that helps them thrive. CBE is a tool and a model getting to that ultimate end, and we want to infuse equity in the process. Culturally responsive and sustaining education can guide each community to design systems that work for their learners, and there's ample room to meet a range of unique needs and preferences while also ensuring that everyone's needs are met. And CBE provides a method and a set of tools to bring together these key practices that can create a different student experience than our predominant one-size-fits-all system. In implementing a capstone project or restorative practices, real-world learning, work-based learning, or any number of other learner-centered practices, we know the value of each of those practices in and of themselves. And competency-based education can bring those practices into a coherent and equitable system that has the potential to be better than the sum of its parts. And that is our in and out list at CompetencyWorks. So now we are going to break into discussion groups. You can pick your own topic. We have some wonderful facilitators who just volunteered to lightly guide the follow the discussion guide. We've got some members of the CompetencyWorks Advisory Board, some bloggers, and some other friends of CompetencyWorks. And there will be an Aurora team member in most rooms as well. So you'll spend some time getting to know each other, dig into discussion, and at the end, summarize some of your top ideas and create a headline and have one person share out.
Super rad group of folks at various levels, really highlighting both the immense power and humanizing force of agency and what it does for schools and communities and kids. Lots of discussion about that, but also the struggles with getting the big mindset shifts, concerns about there being too much agency and the usual toxicity that comes with that, and needing to trouble accountability and making sure that leadership can sustain. So in the end, our headline was agency for sure strengthens your instructional model, but man, you got to be strategic and prep for it in order to sustain that movement all the way through and really let people see it, feel it, hear it, own it, much like we want our students to do. So really powerful group, fun to be part of it. Thanks for including me.
All right. Who has something to represent from out of seat time?
Does anyone from our group want to jump in? All right, I will take the helm then in this one. So our conversation talked a lot about resistance and community will around shifting to seat time and this sort of fear of change in both the community, and that often policy is less of a barrier than the sort of community will and the structures that already exist. And so we also had an extensive conversation around those other structures that maybe don't get as much attention in the policy and research space, like contracts and LMS and SIS and schedules and all of those things that end up being much more challenging. And then the sort of final piece of the conversation is the role that the portrait of the graduate can play. And that we need to shift this world from just like the portrait of a graduate as a box that you check and then you move on, and how we can really create a portrait of a graduate that people use to guide the way that systems and instruction is provided to learners in a more holistic and meaningful way.
Excellent. Take it all in. Our next in navigating generative AI.
All right, so here we talked about the need to build capacity in AI usage for learners, and I think using that learners term across all levels of our organization. So that's teachers, students, I think administrators, and even our non-instruct side of the house, but intentional about there's got to be some training on that. Adapting assessments, or more importantly, evidences of learning for an AI world. So you've got to put some emotion into what we're asking kids to do, because that's something AI can't take over yet. And then importance of ethics and discernment when using AI and applying AI related skills, also with that equity lens as we're thinking through all of this. It's here to stay, we said.
Thank you, Jenny. Out. Using large scale assessments for tracking student progress. Any reps?
I provided wait time for my group in case anyone wants to really jump in there. Okay. But again, this didn't do it justice, but the big headline for us is like, how do we start to reimagine and then redesign some more reliable and valid assessment models? So great ideas from the team included, but and there's more down by the notes in case we want to do it justice. But what I heard people say is like, a really great question posed by one of our members, Sean, said, can there be a model where classroom assessment is reliable and valid enough to replace high stakes summative assessments at the state level? And then we also talked about variability and how we conceive the notion of proficiency, and is it enough? Is that sufficient enough? And so those are some of the questions that, if we're looking at locally based assessment systems, like there will be naturally variability. So how do we get more, how do we get calibrated on and have the same conception or a similar conception of proficiency? And then we also talked about, there has to be a system that if we are going to redesign and pilot and try something new, how do we have complete confidence in the quality of our classroom assessments so that then our state leaders can rely on those as viable ways to as an alternate to standardized state testing. So those are just a few things that came up of people just trying to like see what are others doing and how do we then start to redesign things that just are different than what we've done before.
And our local assessment group, did you come up with any of the answers to those really good questions and insights?
We did. We came up with all the answers to all of the questions, but we can't share them here. Uh, Joking mostly, but we focused when we were talking about local assessment. We really talked about balancing, and I guess I was typing as you put this up, Laurie. So we have a few more words there on the slide, I think, but what we focused on was the idea of balancing, durable skills, assessing durable skills with discrete knowledge and incremental skills that are mostly the kinds of things that we see on sort of statewide and standardized assessments now. How do we incorporate in those bigger picture, more substantive skills into it? And so yeah, the question that we focused on is that balance. And then we talked about local assessments of deeper learning being part of a dialogue and collaboration among teachers throughout the year, that those local performance-based assessments should really focus on enduring skills that you want students to remember a year from now, kind of thinking of that, Grant Wiggins framework. We also had some amazing experts in the room, and one of them from Vermont talked about their system of graduation hierarchies, which is a really helpful framework for thinking about how schools or systems can really organize the kinds of things we want to evaluate in student learning, thinking all the way from the biggest, most important, essential skills all the way down to the very discrete content knowledge that we want students to be able to acquire, that we think maybe are building blocks to lead up to that. So our conversation in summary was really focused on the grain size of the things that we can evaluate at the local level that maybe often aren't always incorporated into the state assessments that we see.
Excellent. And I see some great dialogue in the chat as well. And speaking of Vermont, there are a few different publications. There's one on local assessment systems from a few years ago that Pat Fitzsimmons, who I see here, wrote. And there's lots of great resources in Vermont. So we can get those maybe to the chat. Oh, there we go. Perfect. All right, silos and competition in the field.
All right, I was taking a cue from Soraya and giving my team wait time before I hopped in here, but I'll go ahead and summarize a bit. So our headline is Start Small, Shift Mindsets, Find the Connections. When our group started discussing silos and competition in the field, while it started at that sort of national organizational level, we really realized that there's a lot of parallels between organizational level competitions and school level competition, everything from the concept of our school can't do that because it's not like your school, to department competition between grades and students and families. And so there's this macro micro conversation that took place in our breakout room. And one of the big takeaways for us was realizing that it's really the status quo that's keeping us in these siloed patterns, whether it's the status quo at an individual school or district or state or organization. And that it's going to take really, really brave leaders to be able to listen to the community, listen to the needs of their particular students, and be able to make those decisions to break out of the silos and really engage one another to find what are those relevant entry points, those personalized entry points for students, for organizational change, for individuals, and then take that next step, right? Here's our entry point. What's our first next step after that? But it's going to take the courage of leaders to be able to make those changes and start to dismantle those silos. Thank you.
Well done, Krista. Thank you. And our final group on equity and culturally responsive and sustaining education.
Okay, that was our team. Is competency education is not enough. And one of the things that we were introducing ourselves in our room, how much of what we all said. We all mentioned our hearts. I even saw some people put their hands on their heart of our work. And so a lot of our conversation with this love that we have for students and for equity, and also bridging that gap between we can have competencies and they're really important, yet how do we bridge that of different approaches that. And thank you to our note taker for not only resources that everyone so gracefully shared in the. Another thing that was interesting to talk about is to see the approaches taken from, literally, we had folks from coast to coast in our group, and what's different in the conversations around equity and CBE.
That brings us to the end of our inaugural CompetencyWorks and coffee. My heart is really full, just seeing familiar faces and new faces, and hearing people engaging. If you haven't already saved the date, please save the date for Aurora Institute Symposium in New Orleans this year. And for the next month, the call for presentation proposals is open. So think about, what can you share from your work? Bring students if you can, and also feel free to reach out to us with suggestions for how we can grow the community and really do some of the things that we have been talking about here today.